Well, we're ahead of schedule. That's good. So we'll have a little bit more time to discuss the first group of questions. As Richard said, this is all related to the survey which was done earlier. And the first group is related to the purpose and the scope of the standard. And maybe I can just start by going quickly through the questions of that section so we can then after open the floor for discussions. First question was, is there a need for a separate Canadian standard, or could Canadian archivists adopt some other existing standard or standards, like the standards from the ICA or DAX, the standard in the United States? Which should be an interesting discussion because the results were kind of split half and half, so we'll see. The other question was, are there strengths in RAD that are not found in other descriptive standards and which should be preserved in any revision? Also, are there defects in other existing descriptive standards that a Canadian standard should remedy? So standards from the ICA or DAX, are there defects in those standards that we should be aware of and try to stay away from in the new standards we want to create? And the two last questions were, RAD's approach was to be a one-stop shop for description at all levels in all media. And the question is this still a feasible aim? As you know, ISAG is not media-centered. The chapters are related to different zones of description. So what model should we adopt? Should we stay centered on media or not? So that's the other question. And the last one is RAD's focus is on archival description. Should this focus continue in the standard, or should it expand to take in other functions, such as accessioning, arrangements, subject indexing, administrative and preservation metadata? So should it remain centered on description per se, or should it include other elements of managing archives? So basically that's it, and I assume you read the results of the survey and the assessments which were made of each section. So these were the questions. So anyone wants to break the ice and give us our comments about the purpose and scope of the standard?
Well, I can start. I found it seemed to me encouraging that a lot of people are interested in change. Didn't seem to me there was a lot of feelings like, oh, we've got to keep RAD the way it is. And I thought it was interesting the number of people that were actually willing to even replace RAD with ISAG, which was it's almost a 50-50 split. So I don't know what people think about that. I just throw that out there.
Could I ask a question? I would just be curious around the table what camp people fall into. Who around the table thinks a wholesale adoption of ISAG is the preferred option? How many of you here think that a revised version of RAD along the lines consistent with ISAG is the better solution? And how many would prefer to see any revision be considered independently of existing standards elsewhere? Question mark.
I'll go first. I think that I would probably fall into the revised version of RAD that's in line with ISAG. I don't think ISAG is intended to be a national standard. It's an international standard. The first thing that it says is to be used in conjunction with a national standard. So that said, I think it does make a lot of sense to align any new version with ISAG and build something that we can use with ISAG the way ISAG is intended to be used, I think. And I think I like the structure of ISAG. I think there's a lot we can take from it, but I think to just sort of throw our hands up and say we don't have a national standard anymore is maybe not the very best approach, in my opinion.
Yeah, the way ISAG has been used is quite interesting because, as you say, it was originally intended sort of as a framework for national standards. And you quickly discover how limited it is in detail when you have questions about Adam and so on. Well, where's the note for whatever? So certainly something along the lines of what we attempted with RAD 2, being compliant with ISAD and being within the framework. Speaking to the question about one-stop shopping and so on, I guess the way I've thought about it is a sort of a different answer, which is if you're in a smaller shop, a volunteer-run shop, a one-person shop, you don't want to have to go to all sorts of different standards. But maybe if you're doing item-level, very detailed work, other standards is appropriate, but there's still some necessity for having a one-stop shop if we don't want people just to abandon standards altogether.
It's particularly interesting looking at RAD 2, which I brought with me. For me, one of the core challenges is separating using the standard from the pedagogy of teaching the standard. And one of the observations I've made over the years with the use of the RAD manual, particularly in relation to the media chapters, is that many archivists will use the RAD manual as a definitive to use by example from the RAD manual. And that was one of the deficiencies identified in RAD 2, that it by switching to an ISAG model, it separated the core focus on specific media issues and the learning by example within the RAD manual from actually using the standard.
Well, and also, I'm also wondering what the role of vendors plays here, because I know even for me, in a way, I don't look at whether I use RAD or ISAG. I just look at the information that's going to be most useful for the researcher. So I may be different than a lot of people. I don't know. I work in a different environment. But also with the we've probably got, 5-7 vendors that are used by most of the archives in Canada, I would say, just from my experience and talking with people. I wonder if today that people don't think that the standards matter as much as when we did paper finding aids. Because when I was making paper finding aids, boy, I had to know RAD upside down and forward. But now that it's electronic, I wonder if that's changed the scope of things since RAD was written originally. It's just thoughts that I've had. I don't know if anybody else is in that same boat as me.
I do think it's important to remember too that ISAD, as already been mentioned, is meant to be an international standard, not a national standard. And there are questions about societal representation in a multicultural society that RAD should be able to address that ISAD would never want to touch. Things such as the growing importance of First Nations legal culture, the bilingual reality of the country, those sorts of things that we would never have any input on either if we went on board with RAD 100%, or ISAD 100%.
I think one of the what would have been a good option for this question would have been something about a DAX, because I did answer this, I believe, saying that I think ISAG would be a fine national standard, which I know is contrary to some of what has already been said, but my sense is that just from using our archival description software, that if you can change your standard by switching the template in the software program, what are the differences that we're actually talking about? What gets hidden and what gets, merged? The differences do seem to be pretty minimal and limited to perhaps the notes area. And notwithstanding, multilingual and multicultural issues, that is a great comment. But DAX is a national implementation of ISAG, and I think it would really be in our best interest to look strongly at what it does well and what it doesn't do well in relation to our own conversation about RAD, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. That was a reoccurring thing, and we already have a national implementation of ISAG sitting kind of right in front of us.
I guess my sort of feeling on that, I kind of agree. I think about, yes, like we should look at DAX. I do like the idea of having a sort of distinctive Canadian standard that is aligned with the international ones and DAX. So I think, I think if we do that, it would be good if we articulated the principle that, any changes from the international standard should be explicitly justified. Like, why are we doing that? And I think that could also be a good sort of vehicle for making changes to these other standards. If we've had a good reason for deprecating an element or adding a new element, then it could be a good reason for others, and it could be a way to actually influence the international standards as opposed to not. And I think also ICA, I mean, it's a pretty big organization that's not, they're not famous for transparency or these sort of things, right? So I think there's some benefits to retaining our own, I think.
I would add that one of the potential outcomes of the current EGAD work that's going on with the ICA right now is the potential revision and combination of their 4 standards into one. So I think if we were to wholeheartedly adopt ISAT and, call the work done today, that we could very quickly find things, the carpet shifting under our feet. And if we're making a national implementation of ISAT-G, it will still map and be useful in terms of data exchange at the international level, but that gives us the opportunity nationally to sort of look at any changes that come from the ICA and decide whether or not we want to conform to them or deviate from them. And we have a standard at that point that stands on its own.
I think the last point that was made is pretty interesting, and although it refers to some discussions we might have later in the day regarding that data model, it's true that if we decide to go wholesale with ISAT-G, while ISAT-G is being currently remodeled with the 3 other standards from ICA to be incorporated into one big conceptual model, we may indeed find ourselves being on the losing end, choosing a standard which is going to be remodeled or changed into something else. So the question is, do we want to adjust ourselves to what is being done internationally, or do we want to go with our own needs and go with something like DAX version Canada?
So in terms of adopting something, adopting DAX specifically, at the risk of stating what everybody knows, it's worth remembering where DAX came from, which was and so I'm one of the survivors of the custard wars of the 90s. And so in some ways, the question of adopting DAX comes down to the same kinds of questions we've raised in terms of scope. And where that broke down was the level of detail. And the Canadian group, felt very strongly at the time that the level of detail was needed, the media detail was needed, whereas the American group, the audience was very focused on the smaller institutions to have a simple standard. Maybe that's shifted over the years, but it kind of comes down to the same thing. The structure is the same as RAD 2. It was basically they added RAD 2 and they got rid of a lot of the detail. So it would be certainly consistent with what we're talking about, but it does kind of come down to that fundamental question of what the scope is.
And also, one thing that I wanted to add is that by keeping RAD, we keep control, right? Because if we go to ISAT-G or we go to DAX or any of the other ones, we lose control of it ourselves. So then, like what others were saying, if things happen, then we have to go with those things happening. We have less control over it. And the other thing I wanted to say, because I was in Texas for a year, is that I heard from numerous people how wonderful Canadian archivists were, which was very nice. They really respected us. And then we kind of sort of disappeared from the map about 5 years ago. And we probably all know why that was, because our funding, was we don't have the funding that we used to have. But the other thing that I would want to mention is RAD is Canadian. And it was interesting being down in Texas because I got to see how people viewed us from the States, or many people that I met. And I guess I would ask, is it important for us to have our own standard so that we are Canadian archivists and not just archivists of the world? And there can be a distinction there. I don't know whether it matters. I think personally it does for me. Being a Canadian in Texas, it was like, oh yeah, I'm a Canadian archivist and always will be. So I sort of throw that out there to see if our national existence on the world stage also plays a part in this. And by keeping RAD, that would keep us as Canadians in a world scope.
If I could just add what I meant to add in terms of DACs, that's where things broke down. If we wanted to go back to something like that sort of structure, that's an opening to again say, is it time for a North American standard, if that's the direction we wanted to go. But I certainly take the point about the Canadian identity, because I also went to school in the States, so it was quite interesting.
The other thing to add to that, I mean, that's a really interesting observation, Lisa, and the flip side of that I have noticed by working and talking to archivists in the United States is that they are also much more conversant in other standards, and they are more regular and more easy to adapt and adopt other standards. And I noticed that in some of the responses about other standards, there's this idea, well, we don't know what those are, and or that there's this idea that it presupposes knowledge of these standards, and I think that we should be living in an archival community where knowledge of those other standards is a core part of what we do. I guess I can just leave it at that, but there are other standards, and particularly in relation to this media-specific issue, like us continuing to retain media-specific descriptive rules that are contrary or not aligned with these other standards is only going to create problems for us down the road, particularly when we're trying to aggregate data. So I actually really like the idea of a DACS kind of model where we have our own standard, but when you get down into those media issues, it can be expanded, or it can be connected to other metadata standards that have been maintained by communities of experts.
I would just add as well on the issue of maintenance that obviously a national standard is a distinctive aspect of Canadian archiving, but the history of RAD demonstrates the difficulties associated with maintenance of a standard, and we should be careful to think about that as well, particularly moving forward with digital systems and so on. We want to be nimble enough to be able to respond to changing environments, and maybe one of the ways of managing change is to be part of something bigger, so that it's not just the Canadian archival community that has to adjust to a particular situation.
I think in the absence of a clear understanding of the way that ICA functions and the way its committees function, I don't think that we should ourselves make any assumptions about the ability to go to ICA and say, we've decided we don't need a national standard, but we want to influence the international standard, and we'd like these things to be incorporated into your standard. I think it highly unlikely that they would be receptive. The decisions made around who belongs to those committees are ones that are made at a level that is, one that is completely mysterious to me. And there are a lot of competing imperatives with ICA. I think they're doing really interesting work. I just think that they already said that this is not supposed to be a standard that's supposed to accommodate all the national needs, that national jurisdictions should be developing their own standard to work in conjunction with it. So the idea of going to ICA and expecting that they are going to adapt to meet national needs when it was never intended to meet those, it was working on a much broader level, I don't think that's a workable assumption.
Sort of one idea, like it seems to me there's sort of like a kind of division between people that want a very simple, sleek kind of model, and also some others that see the strengths in the detail. But is one way to have a bit of both, if we could kind of distinguish between having a standard, which is really a stripped down document that is just, here's the data elements, these are the things that map to the ICA standards and to DAX, and we keep a crosswalk so that it's always a lot, we know how it relates to the old RAD as well, but then we move the detail into another document, which I think, Dan, you had kind of mentioned this in the BC consultation, and I think it's come out in some of the survey results too, but this idea of having like an implementation guidelines where all that detail could go, where you could have things like, how do you apply this at different levels of description for different media, controlled taxonomies associated with it. I mean, I agree that could be quite difficult to do and maintain as well, but it could also be something opened up to institutions to contribute. Like, here's what we do. Here's what CCAD recommends as maybe best practice, but it's not the same as the small set of elements that is a standard that we revise every 5 years that we keep looking at when changes happen elsewhere. I don't know.
Just to add to that, I mean, the advantage to that sort of approach is that it sort of teases apart some of the issues. I mean, you sort of coalesce around a set of data elements, basically, and changing or adding or deprecating them becomes a more specific but larger discussion. But in terms of actually implementing any individual descriptive element, it's a set of instructions that can be kind of revised as needed or updated. People can submit suggestions. And we'll talk about maintenance later, but it seems to be kind of coming up. It's like, well, whatever decision we make has these implications for how we are going to, continue to live by that decision. And I think it's the EAD subcommittee has sort of moved to this like rolling revision model where they're just constantly accepting revisions. They take a proposal and they prepare it and they send it out to the community and get feedback and then make a decision. And it allows them to be much more responsive to very specific issues in terms of the implementation or the rules about how to apply a particular element. It's something to perhaps think about if we were to go with that model where we have sort of a cluster of documents to guide sort of how we do the description.
I'd just like to add to that. Excuse me. I would agree that we all agree that something has to happen. And I think from the survey results, we're seeing a need for more of an iterative process. And I think part of that is to think about the culture, where we are now as a profession, and how can we create that iterative culture where there's an expectation that things are going to happen at certain points and decisions, and that it involves the whole community. So part of me feels things are going to change, the rules are going to change, but how do we make sure that the community at every level, and it includes the schools and it includes the one-person shop, how do we make sure that everybody's involved in that process? And how do we create that structure? What kind of technology do we use to make sure that it becomes normalized? Whereas I feel some of the stalling out that happens is a part of a previous way of doing things, which now we have lots of systems that could support that. So it's about culture and articulating like how do we infuse the RAD is all it. You can see our values reflected in the standard. How do we make sure that those values continue to be articulated and get into the community as well?
I think what leans me towards a more national approach to a standard rather than a wholesale adoption of an international standard is that one of the great benefits of RAD over its existence has been to cause the evolution of idiosyncratic descriptive practices pre-RAD into a process that is expressive or acknowledging all types of institutions, from the lone arranger to the large institutions. And it's that evolutionary power that I think we lose if we wholesale adopt an international standard without specific national elements and national character. In particular, perhaps not the media-specific elements, but I think it's the level of detail that adapts to local practice that I think is a particularly national characteristic of our standard.
Just in terms of what Richard mentioned there, the idea of having a separate implementation guide, one of the advantages of doing this, I think, is in the way that we can deal with the responsiveness to changes. Media, for example, is a moving target, and it's something that we're constantly developing, new media, but also new best practices around. Whereas I think that when we're talking about actual rules for standardizing description, those should be generalized and those should be very slow to change, and they should generally apply at a higher level across media. So if we're talking about creating a standard that's fairly light and something that we can maintain and without having to constantly revise, this can be sort of the core RAD revision, whereas the implementation guideline is something that I could, imagine in the future living in a repository that accepts pull requests from the community where people can actually have those kind of constant revisions going on as new media are developing, as new issues are coming up. It allows that part of the implementation to be more flexible and to evolve as it needs to without having to bring together a whole committee to revisit all the rules and sort of assess those.
Yeah, and just adding to that idea about high-level perspective and flexibility, as a survivor of institutional convergence, I can give testimony to the difficulty of trying to work across disciplines where, for example, natural sciences already have very sophisticated ontologies to describe the work that they're doing. And it's not our place to start giving instructions on how they should manage those. However, they are still working in various media that do have an archival value in the long term. Trying to get into that conversation will only happen if we have a very flexible, high-level approach to those disciplines.
I think another thing to think about, if in terms of, I don't think it's possible to adopt ISAG, but wholesale. But in terms of doing like some kind of a national implementation of something that is very compatible with ISAG, we can also address things that aren't really being done very well by other standards, right? Like I think there's been over a decade of discussion in the archival literature about the need to account more for what archivists do to records, and no standard does that well. So, we could see an opportunity to build in elements that actually really do something about that. And also, there's an increasing emphasis also on custodial history and on the history of what's happened to records over time. And again, I don't think any standard, ISAG does maybe a better job of that than RAD, but it's still not doing a really, really great job of it. So I think we should also look at what the opportunities are as a community. Again, like RAD was really forward thinking, right? It was a big deal and it was a huge thing internationally that Canada did, came up with RAD. And I think maybe this is an opportunity to do something really forward thinking again, right? And to address some of the shortcomings of archival description generally as it exists now. So there's, obvious need for ways to describe electronic records better than RAD does, but there's also other parts of descriptive standards that I think need to be readdressed, and specifically I really think accountability issues. The description control area in ISAG doesn't really do that much, right? And archival history. So I would like to see discussion about things like that as well, about what a Canadian standard could do better than what other standards are doing currently.
On the same subject, and I was going to re-ask the question about our standard. Do we want it to be exclusively centered on description, or do we want it to integrate other information about accessioning, about arrangement. Well, description talks about arrangement, but accessioning, monetary appraisal, what have you. Do you think we should stay with descriptive items only, or encompass other activities surrounded with the gestion, with the management of archives? For instance, one of the ICA standards pertains to functions which generate documentation. So should a standard have this component in it too? So what do you think?
On the topic of one-stop shop and other related standards and so on, I think one of the things that's changed a lot since RAD came out in the early 90s is the use of the internet. And I actually don't think it's that big a deal for people to go to multiple sources if you're pointing towards standards that are open and readily available online. So I'm not sure. I see a lot of the kind of detailed instruction in RAD as being, I agree with the suggestion that it would be helpful to have it in a secondary document, an implementation guideline or something like that, that would be more flexible, easier to update and so on, while keeping the sort of core focused on archival description. If we need additional standards, we should point out to additional standards that are developed to meet other ends. But I would agree that we should sort of be relatively clear that, this is what we are trying to do, is this important function that's at the heart of all of this. And then if there are additional standards that are needed or that exist that we can point to, we should point towards those, but not necessarily feel that we have to stitch it all into one package.
That being said, the standard should be sufficiently robust that a smaller institution shouldn't have to go to get a separate standard to deal with a purely one-off issue that their institution has to resolve. That the standard should be sufficiently flexible to incorporate that. I'm thinking of other aspects of shifting thought around archival description. I keep coming back to the two components of RAD in my mind, both the description of records, but the description of the creators of records. And it's critical in an environment which is being shaped by our vendors who are creating our databases, but also by our users who don't care about our carefully crafted hierarchies and would rather just get right to the meat on the bones. And so for us, it's critical to find a mechanism by which we can impose context on a user base that doesn't care about our context. And so how does our standard adapt in an electronic world? We're no longer dealing with period space, dash space, and I really I also want to get away from the predominant dates wars where it was comma space parenthesis predominant versus semicolon space. That drives me crazy, and that's that iterative nature of arguments around the development of the standard. And to have the standard, particularly because it's motivated by our vendors who have designed systems to capture these data elements irrespective of our punctuation and our data containers, we should find a way to develop a standard that remains flexible despite the idiosyncratic nature of description in Canada and the idiosyncratic nature of some of the databases that we use.
I'd just like to respond to that in the sense that vendors will adjust. If we give them a standard, they will follow the standard. So I think part of that is we have to take responsibility and clearly articulate our values, and whether it involves punctuation or not. I love the comma and the colon, but I know it's one of those old school things that you sort of love to do, but I just want to be clear that vendors will, if we tell them what to do, they will, within reason, they have to adjust. And I think it's one of those things where we have to keep pushing. This is what we want. If you can't provide that to us, we'll go somewhere else. We'll go to the other 3 vendors. But anyways.
I think that it was a fairly strongly held principle in the first go-around in the development of RAD that there should be, and this might be anticipating conversations we'll have later in the day, it was felt fairly strongly that when it comes to the development of a standard, the responsibility should be the responsibility of the profession, which is why it was the Bureau of Canadian Archivists. Of course, it was Toward Descriptive Standards was published around the time that the Canadian Council of Archives came into existence. So while the work was funded by the Canadian Council of Archives, it was seen as a product of the Bureau of Canadian Archivists. And the feeling was that development issues are issues to be sorted out by the profession, independent of specific institutional needs. And there was a feeling that institutions, particularly large institutions, should not be imposing their will on the development of a standard, but that once the standard had been developed, the maintenance of the standard shifted over to what was, in our case, the body that represented the interests of institutions as well as the profession. So that during the development of RAD, this was a very strong point. And there was, in the early state, we had a representative from the National Archives on all of our committees. And there was a lot of discussion about having a National Archives representative. Now, in all of those working groups, they were a great asset. But there were points of tension in terms of what institutional needs are and what the profession's needs are. So it's partly to support what Anna was saying in terms of having a clear sense of what is seen to be the values of the profession, the values of description, taking into account that some of the values that are articulated in RAD need to be revisited. The other thing I was going to say was that in the United States, after they decided that APPM, for those of you who don't remember, archives personal papers and manuscripts, which was the Americans' first kick at a standard, which was basically an adaptation of Chapter 4 on manuscripts from the Anglo-American cataloging rules. When that standard had run its course, the decision of the American community initially was that they would not develop another standard. And you may remember our context, content, and structure of David Bierman et al. That was partly a product of the decision that what they would do for the American archival community would be inundate them with all of the standards that existed relating to data content, data context, data structure, and there would be this huge mélange out of which they could extract their standards. And I think it was a very useful exercise in alerting people to the complexity of standards and all of the different levels at which standards exist. But in the end, it was not something that people were able, they ended up having to go to, which is when Custard was born. But I think there was a recognition that there's this balancing act. I think this is what Richard has been talking about, and Greg, you were also mentioning this, that you have to have a document that's going to provide sufficiently clear instructions that people can use it in most circumstances, but that you also allow them to refer to, make crosswalks to other standards or related standards. And I think some of this might become clearer to us if we actually immersed ourselves in trying to figure out what would a standard for the description of digital records look like. Because my understanding is that in many institutions, the descriptive systems for digital records are sitting kind of as parallel systems beside the traditional descriptive systems. And whether these are reconcilable, I don't know. But I think this is, to go to Jennifer's point, a real contribution that we could be making to this discussion could be in this area of figuring out what would a description standard for digital records look like.
Another thing I wanted to say in terms of purpose and scope, and I don't know if we're ready as a profession yet to go here, but we might want to also think about the different purposes that description serves, that it has it's an administrative tool for us, but it's also an access tool. So, I think I just think that's a question we need to think a little bit more about as well, is what is can it do, how does it do everything, right? How do we develop a standard that does everything, and is that something we can do? And so I think that's another place where we could sort of push things a little bit beyond. I think that's something as you see as you have more description online, right? That there's a difference between what works for us and what works for other people to access records.
Well, and also my concern is if we go outside of the description only, how are we going to keep that up? Because it's taken a lot of time, a lot of energy just to do the descriptive, just to do RAD itself. And if we add other components to it, that's great, but how are we going to keep those up? Because there are only so many archivists across Canada, and how can we realistically keep all of that up? Even though I really like the idea of doing a general, higher level standard and then saying, okay, here are the examples, and the examples are things that we can change on the fly, or like the EAD people have been doing that kind of change. I think realistically that's where we're going. And where society is going, and where the internet is going. But yeah, so that was, I just wonder like how much energy it would take to do more than descriptive standards, and how we would be able to do that in practice, because it does take a lot of energy and time.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting how we've already had this much discussion around whether or not ISAD-G could work for us, but I almost feel like we would have to have a related discussion about whether or not ISAR CPF covers authority records enough, or whether we want to follow the DAX model and incorporate elements of authority record creation into a revised RAD. But overall, I do want to echo sentiments that have already been made, that I don't think that we should be trying to cover every single aspect within this one standard. I think that it should be focused primarily on archival description. There's already work underway to create a national accession standard, and I think that's great, and I think that should remain a separate document. If we need minor guidance on certain elements, I mean, another potential one is the creation of like index terms or whatever. That's another element that comes up often in archival description and doesn't seem to be covered by the standard. Then it's worth discussing, but I think those can be rabbit holes that can prevent us from really like getting a lot done within this meeting and really dealing with the core issue of archival description.
Yeah, I kind of agree with those sentiments about, and I think even in the survey that kind of came out with most people saw value in those other endeavors or for standards, but it made sense to keep them separate from description. Yeah, that makes sense to me, I think.
I like that too, the hiving off of the different activities and having their own standards. So for authority files versus accessions. And I hate to say this, but if we are going to do that, then is there a case to be made for some kind of a overarching committee to make sure that all of those different standards are coordinated somehow? Because as we're doing the accession standard right now, my biggest worry is, okay, we'll write a standard and we'll propose it, and then it'll be completely different than whatever comes out of the RAD committee meetings. And they won't be able to talk to each other, and we'll be back to square one. So that, just a thought.
I was going to ask Chris that once upon a time there was a CCA committee called the Standards Committee, and what they did was they would people would propose standards, some of them in the area of preservation. That was actually how the arrangement, I don't know how to describe it, I won't find an adjective in enough time, the committee that was trying to develop some kind of principles around arrangement that didn't really go really far. Anyway, that came out of the work of the Standards Committee, which was chaired by Marion B.A. for a number of years. But what they would do is they would invite the community to bring forward standards, and they were supposed to be keeping a database of standards, and that was a mechanism that was trying to say, you know, this is a standard for this. This is what it accomplishes, and there was I don't remember in the end what the decision was around whether there would be a formal endorsation. The only standard I think that was ever formally endorsed by the Standards Committee was RAD, not surprisingly, but I think that there was a mechanism that was intended to deal with things like have an opinion from the CCA about the usefulness of this standard, and I wonder if some mechanism like that could be one of the ways in which some of these complementary standards and related standards where you can make reference to them, and they would be able to somehow figure out what those things were about. Is there still a standards committee?
There is a standards committee. There is a structure for the standards committee, but that committee has been dormant since 2012. But it is our hope that we would be able to revitalize that group for that purpose specifically. And there was a database of standards under development when everything ground to a halt. We still have all the content. It would need to be refreshed, but we have still retained all that information.
Some really interesting points being raised here, and I really liked what Jennifer was saying earlier about the overlapping functions of different standards, and the fact that there are the standards aren't distinct, and so there's always going to be elements that overlap between two standards. I think of something like mods and premise, where there's aspects of rights, and there's other characteristics of records that need to be, or information resources that need to be recorded in both preservation metadata for premise and descriptive metadata for mods. And the coordination of those two standards, this is my understanding of this, Kat or Bill could probably speak to this much more effectively than I could, but my understanding is that this has been a challenge to sort of figure out the relationship between, for example, mods and premise. I think being clear about what the standard is intending to do, and also understanding what are the other standards out there. So not just expecting there to be something that will fill a gap, but to actually identify what is the other standard that's filling that gap, how does it behave, how can our standard play well or interact with it or whatever, with that other standard, so that the question of the implementation guide, for example, shouldn't be something that it's just kind of a dumping ground of issues that the standards committee doesn't want to deal with. The implementation guide should be an implementation guide that has its own maintenance activity, and that is looking at evaluating what are the other pieces out there, how does the descriptive standard interact with those, and in the end, making decisions about whether should elements that are shared between different standards, whether it's accessioning or preservation metadata or whatever, should those overlapping elements be duplicated? So do we need to have a slightly different take on preservation metadata that's part of the descriptive standard? Or is it easier to manage the data? Does the client end up with a better result if we draw from those standards, so that there's only, there's a sharing of elements between the standards? What is the best way of managing this data in order to manage our records, I think, and to provide access to our records is the key question. But I think the idea of a one-stop shop presupposes that that's the best way of doing this in a world that has fundamentally changed in how we manage data. What do we want our data to do as well? I mean, our objectives have fundamentally changed over the last 25 years in terms of being able to share data, being able to build on each other's data, to be able to automate federated searching and things like this. So.
I think those are great points, Greg. And, mods and premise, I think, rely on the Dublin core element set from the 1990s, and they have their own special extensions. So that's kind of an interesting model to look at, that there's a core set of data elements plus whatever specialized extensions are required for a need. And I'm almost thinking this could be a model that RAD could provide this core set, and then there would be extensions for whatever activities are required. And I really take your point about what do we want to do with our data. I take that very seriously, because the semantic web is talked about a lot, and in order for the semantic web to work properly, you have to know how you've defined your data. You have to know what entity you're describing, and those definitions have to be understood out there by the rest of the web. So perhaps for the archives community, I'm wondering if ICA is working at a very high theoretical level to define what the entities are that this community is describing, and then are they defining a core set of elements? And maybe someone involved in IGAD might be able to speak to that.
I am on EGAD, and I'm happy to speak to the work that they're doing. I just don't know if now is the appropriate time, or there is a specific question, and I think in the next section about the model. So whenever it's relevant, I can clarify anything. Try to clarify whatever. Yeah.
It might be helpful if you just explained a little bit about EGAD and, because the process, the opacity of ICA processes has been raised a couple times already. So maybe you can speak a little bit to the structure and what's going on with EGAD.
So I'm not intimately familiar with, I think Heather said, how people are chosen or how committees are structured or working plans. My involvement is really just on doing the work of the group. And so the work that they're doing right now is focused on two different levels. Because there's different, I believe technically there's 4 groups, though really the focus has been on just the conceptual model and the ontology that lies above that. And what they're trying to do is exactly what Bill just said. They're trying to define the core entities that are relevant to describing records. So things like agents, records, mandates, business or function. I'm going to forget some now. Then there's other ones like places, dates, anything can be a subject, things like that. There are some presentations that they've done that are publicly accessible. For example, they presented at SAA in Cleveland last year. There's been some presentations in Europe that I can't recall specifically where, but they provided an introduction to those entities in the model, as well as progress updates on where they're at. So the ontology level is basically like a broader worldview where things are the most abstract. So for an example, for something like an agent, you would get into details like a biological agent versus something else, like you could have a system that takes actions. So that's at the ontology level, and they'd be defining relationships between all of these things, which would resemble things you'd see in the semantic web, like an RDF type statement. So they're mapping those out. At the conceptual model level, it's a little bit more familiar to what you'd think of, well, when I look at ISAT-G or ISAR CPF, because you're saying, well, for the agent in the conceptual model level, really we're talking about a person, a corporate body, or perhaps one of those machine type agents. And then we're identifying for the agents, for records, for mandates, for business, for all of those entities, what are the core elements that we want to identify. So things like all the usual suspects like names, titles, dates, and part of the work that was done was to analyze the existing 4 ICA standards to see how things, because there was no explicit model, but obviously there was one, you could identify these entities in there and to say, well, in the original 4 standards, how were things laid out, and then this new work we're doing, and then at some point they'll have to connect. And the intent was to have a draft of the conceptual model by the end of December. That's passed, and right now we're working very hard on trying to solidify this first draft for community review. The intent was to distribute it to the community to get feedback, with the first draft of the ontology following shortly after the original intent was spring 2016. So yes, we're behind, but it should be soon in the near future. And I don't personally know enough about culture or decisions, the administration of IC to say why there hasn't been more sharing up to date, other than, as I said, there's been at various conferences in the States and in Europe, there has been
sharing with the community already with the outline of what's going on, though not a full draft. That's about all. If there's any questions, I can try to elaborate further. I brought a copy of the Cleveland presentation, or I can certainly send links to whatever I'm aware of after, if that helps at all.
And I see most of you have your laptops with you, and on the ICA webpage, they have a section for EGAD, and within that, there's a subsection for EGAD resources, in which you have recommended readings, and they have many links towards, well, ICA standards, but an introduction to conceptual models, archival conceptual models, records management standards, RAD is in there. So there's a lot of references, resources in there for on the broader topic. Also, I was just given a note by Isabelle just to mention that if during the day you wish to tweet about today's discussions, I don't think there's anything confidential being said here, please do so. And the mot-click, the word is RAD meeting 16, if you want to tweet about today's discussions.
Is there a standard for how that's?
I don't know. We'll have to discuss a standard or a model to tweet art. Not really. We have about 15 minutes left to this session. Maybe I want to open another. I think it falls within that broader topic we're discussing, the scope and the purpose of the standard, regarding our colleagues in other cultural milieu and other disciplines, such as museums and libraries, on how much we want to think about them and think about being linked somehow to their own work in description and access to be more compatible and be more in line with what our colleagues are doing. I worked most of my career as an archivist in museums, so I was able to see what, for instance, museums are doing in terms of describing their collections and how they share them online. And so how much do we want to be aligned with or think about the other disciplines in what we do as a group for archival description?
I just wanted to say with museums, their standards aren't very standardized. I know in Alberta they have kind of a very loose standard that they follow. So I think it would be really tough to follow what they're doing in any way, considering how, like, I think archives, we come together better and we're standardized nationally, whereas museums aren't. So.
Yeah, and I would agree. I've seen all sorts of things that are used, and everybody has their own specific standard that they like. So there, in my experience, there's been a lot of variation, and I don't even know how you would go there, because really it depends what system or systems people are using in each workplace. In my experience, it can be 18 different systems, or it can be 3 different systems. And a lot of times the archivist has to work into those systems, and it becomes very complex. So personally, I would also think it would be hard to do.
However, I should just mention that I was referring to more to the digital aspect of it and how to share it online, which might be addressed in another session later today. So maybe we'll keep that for later because there's possibilities there. And about our discussions regarding EGAD also, there's a good article, a good resource. Well, I have the French version here. It's Vers un modèle conceptuel international pour la description. I think in English it's towards an international model, something, which describes pretty much what they're trying to do in bringing together their 4 standards within one model and using some of the other standards or models which have been developed elsewhere. They're talking about Australia, New Zealand, Finland, I think. So they're mentioning a lot of those other standards which we alluded to a few minutes ago, so just to mention that in passing.
Yeah, just looking at the RBCM, they seem to be, for the museums, conceptualizing currently the museum's mission as being a public space of dialogue concerning knowledge and culture, which is such a high level. It's like trying to organize information as a concept. It's just, I can't see how you can put a standard towards it, especially with so much of the emphasis being placed today on representation and input from the general public. So I don't know if we can actually, I mean, that sounds very negative, but I'm struggling to see how we can strike a standard with the museum concept that's in the direction that it's going right now. Maybe that's too negative, I don't know.
Certainly on the library side, integration and crosswalking couldn't be more important. I mean, I know many of you will be like me in a library environment where if it's not in the catalog, they think it's not discoverable. And they're discovering digitization. We've had major digitization over the last few years in mods. And in some cases, that's a better system for whatever the environment is. And so you don't want to be sort of isolated over here and come and search Archives Canada and you can't find it here. So, and I mean, the good news is even in the existing standard at a basic level, things are crosswalkable, but it's certainly something you want to keep in mind in terms of where a larger community of users is now and creators is basically making archival material accessible, but not necessarily from an archival point of view.
I think there's I know I understood that part of EGAD's mandate was to come up with was to consider the making what they were doing compatible with CDOC, which had been an extended model starting with objects, the standardization for the representation of objects, and then had built within it extensions to accommodate FRBR, the bibliographic standard. And I thought part of EGAD's charge was to have a conceptual model that could also be compatible with that model. That was one point. I think in the literature on convergence, there is a growing body of literature, I think, speaking of particularly people who are working with, I'm talking about within the museum community. There are concerns about some of the standards and the internationalization of the standards, that they are leveling and flattening the meaning of cultural objects, and that advocacy for discussions of convergence to begin with a recognition of the differences between archives, libraries, and museums, and to develop descriptive systems that are going to build on the richness of their representational models rather than level the differences between those representational models. So I would say that the discussion about converging description is one that's fairly fraught within at least within the academic discourse on the topic.
Just to supplement, yes, the EGAD was looking at not only CDOC CRM, but also the FRBR and RDA. This was a little bit, not really the focus at the moment, but initially when trying to identify the entities and thinking about interoperating. And also the fact that some of the models that are being developed elsewhere, like in Finland and Spain, Finland in particular was trying really hard to closely align with RDA. And so some of the language is similar. You see a lot of manifestation, singleton, and stuff like that. But I'm not sure the initial draft of the EGAD model, how much it will resemble, or I don't think that the initial cut will be, well, here's how it aligns specifically with CDOC, or here's how it aligns specifically with FRBR, because the core focus is really to identify something that's uniquely archival. With the secondary consideration, I think would be, well, okay, no, how would it align with these things? But I had another point there, but now I've lost it. So
I think Tim, your comment about sort of the library, particularly like the academic library environment, is spot on. I work with a lot of librarians who don't quite understand why our material is not in the OPAC. And there are archives that have succeeded in doing that, but it's still challenging. And even our own archives catalog has its own problems with taking paper-based data and putting it into a searchable system. We had something like 150 series descriptions called correspondence, because at the time it made sense to follow that principle of inheritance, and maybe it was being done poorly. It's not consistent. We have a lot of data, but we now know that the principle of inheritance that was sort of articulated in RAD doesn't really work in a database. And it's not enough to just provide the level of description, because the user does not understand that. Fundamentally, they don't get what we're talking about. So we have sort of locally decided that we don't follow that principle, and we follow instead the principle of attention to the user. And a lot of this conversation about sort of compatibility just had me thinking about what are the principles of what we're doing. And to me, one of the most valuable pieces of RAD is the statement of principles, and it does need to be revised, I think, to reflect the purpose and scope and the sort of modern reality that we work in. But I don't really have a good answer to my librarian colleagues as to why our data is still not in the OPAC, and why is Dublin Core not good enough for us? Heather, your comments about this convergent is really fascinating, because I have always thought we should be leveling out, and now I'm not so sure. But still, at the end of the day, Dublin Core, which Bill spoke about, and qualified Dublin Core, could really be an excellent model if we decide to sort of hive off the core elements of our standard and sort of have some implementation guide. I still, again, don't have a good answer as to why. I've resisted putting our stuff in DSpace, because it would mean we would have Dublin Core descriptions and we would have RAD descriptions over here, and it would make my life difficult. But it was probably a detriment to our end users, because we had at one point a single place for digital content, and now we have two, and we're struggling with this idea of unifying the search interface. And these things don't necessarily bear on the standard itself, but I think it's all things that we should be considering when we're going forward.
Is this an area where if we did ever get the some kind of standards committee again, like a general one, where that could be a home for all these sort of crosswalks, where the key thing would be to have, okay, we've got our standard, but to know exactly how it maps over to all these other ones, and to have like an official home for that, so vendors could know exactly how we're implementing this and that, and I think it would maybe help those kind of issues.
CCAT has done that in the past. In fact, you might still find the RAD to EAD crosswalk on the CCA website, which now relates to EAD 2002, I guess. But certainly that's been something that has been looked at in the past, so that makes sense.
I'll just add that my own experience working with crosswalks is they really don't give you everything you need to know, and that they're useful reference tools, but when you're actually migrating data from one standard to another, it is significantly more complicated, and it's probably not enough to just map the data elements. For instance, the crosswalk that we had to build at Dalhousie involved it was a modified version of, I think, an artifactual crosswalk, where we needed to know specifically what the archivist toolkit did, because it does something different than what the sort of prevalent crosswalks say it should do, and it has attributes, and there are sub-elements and things like that, and so it's like you need an interpretation guide for the crosswalks, and you need test. You still need to do the project, and the crosswalk doesn't answer all those questions for you.
Can I just add a footnote to what Heather said about CDOC and flattening? That the library community was very interested in what CDOC was doing, and coming from the background of Ferber, they were trying to see how that could fit, but I think the result is that they're redoing Ferber, and they're going to have something called the Library Reference Model that you should be hearing more about this year, coming out of IFLA. And that is supposed to be the new theoretical model for bibliographic description. But it's just to say that CDOC CRM doesn't serve, they decided that CDOC CRM doesn't really serve library needs, so.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of this session. Just to go back on some of the topics which were mentioned. One of the things that was mentioned is that, for example, if we choose to go with, well, IZG was mentioned a lot, of course, but if we choose to go with a national standard like DAX, some suggested that it was a good example of the implementation of a national standard using IZG. But it was also mentioned that keeping RAD was also a good way of keeping control over, or keeping something similar to RAD would be a good way to keep control of our own national standard for archival description. The media-specific issue was a question with RAD2, and I think it still is an issue today to determine if we want to keep that level of, in French we say granularité, of specific description for different types of media. ICA and EGAD are to be kept in mind while we're doing this exercise. Although we recognize that if we go to ICA, they will probably not change their standards to accommodate Canadian realities, although it would be important to still be involved in EGAD. Also, there seemed to be a consensus on the fact that whatever standard we choose, it should be focused mainly on description, with possibilities to link with other systems of description or information regarding other functions, such as accessioning and others. And we also mentioned that it would be probably the best to have a core standard which is solid but also flexible enough for us to use, on which to base our descriptions, going with other more specific standards. Also, the question regarding description, is it an access tool for our users, or is it an administrative tools for us archivists? Actually, it's both, but what kind of attention we should give to these two items? And it was just mentioned that the standards committee for the CCA should, it would be a good idea to have a body or something that keeps track of the different standards being developed or used worldwide, so we have something to base our discussions on our own standard. And just overall, I think that through the different discussions, also users were mentioned a lot, so I think this is also something that is underlying our whole discussion, that users are our main objective and we don't want to forget them. So roughly that's it. I don't know if someone wants to add something else. We have still a few minutes before the break, or...
Well, maybe just to ask like the question Heather had raised initially, which was like, if we are trying to write up a report for CCAD, do we have any firm consensus around this whole issue of, do we want to use ISAG? Do we want to keep a separate Canadian standard aligned with ISAG? Like, my sense is maybe I'll turn it over.
Okay, I'll say that I would like to see a standard, a national standard that is in alignment with ISAG. That would be my preference.
Yep, me too. National standard. It can be revised drastically, but I think we should have one that works with ISAG.
I would just add, that RAD has to stay, but we should be ruthless. Like, here's our opportunity to trim, and completely revise if necessary.
It seems to me that we're actually talking about like this, the national flavor of ISAD is ISAD, right? That is the point of ISAD, is to have the national flavor below it. So I don't necessarily see the distinction that's being made between endorsing the structure or approach of ISAD, but having a national standard versus endorsing ISAD. It seems to me that.
We can't adopt ISAD because it's an international standard that needs a national implementation, right? But we can develop a national implementation of it. I don't think we should adopt DACS because that's a national implementation in a context where archival theory is really quite different than it is here. So I think, but it can still be RAD. It can still be a Canadian standard. But if the question is, do we adopt ISAD-G, I don't think we can do that. But we can use it as the same way that, and that's what RAD 2, that's how it was developed, right? And that's how DACS came about as well. So, so I don't think it is a really different thing. It's just that you can't just say we're going to use ISAD-G.
Yeah, I think that part of that was the fact that we don't sit on the ICA committee. Mm-hmm. And some of the, I think coming out of some of the survey questions or the answers, the idea that, well, we don't have enough resources, so we should have ICA do it and try to influence it. I think it was partly that's not something that we can assume that's viable. That's the distinction, not that there's a fundamental distinction between the national standard that will emerge and whatever ISAD-G is at the moment.
We wouldn't have the flexibility we've been talking about if we are using ISAD-G, because we can, if we have a national implementation, we can, but otherwise we don't have that same flexibility.
I definitely agree. I just want to point out that it's a legitimate question because lots of institutions are just using ISAD-G without any national standard. So.
And there was a lot of responses in the surveys that just advocated that strongly in some points, so it is worth discussing.
But that might indicate that an ISAD-G-like standard is doing something that RAD isn't doing, but not necessarily that that's the best long-term approach to descriptive standards in Canada, right? So I think that I like ISAD-G a lot. I just think that we need something that is behind, that is our way of doing ISAD-G, so that when you have questions about all the things that ISAD-G doesn't say, you have somewhere to go and find those, right?
Maybe the question then should be, is there anybody who feels differently? 'Cause so far I feel like we're kind of all saying the same thing at this point, and we might have found our first point of agreement.
Yeah, I did answer the survey saying I think we should adopt ISAD-G, but I think at this point it's a bit of a semantic issue, really. Greg, ISAD is the national version of ISAD-G. I think there's a price to pay for the flexibility that we're looking for, and I don't know that the community has the capacity to do this over the long term. And I will also say that if we sort of adopt the principle here today that what we're going to endorse is a revised version of RAD that is aligned with ISAD-G, that isn't really altogether that different than adopting ISAD-G, because we still have put the onus on us to adapt and revise as ISAD-G is revised, and there's still this question then, like, how involved are we in that process? So, I think if we're telling ourselves, and I'm perfectly fine endorsing that position that, we should completely revise our national standard to be in alignment with the international standard, it still brings this question up of how do we ensure that we can maintain that position if the sense is that, well, we don't really know what ICA is going to do. ISAD-G could drastically change, and then the onus would again be on us to maintain this position that we're going to have a national implementation of ISAD-G. So it's not going to simplify things for us substantially, I don't think. even though it's a good position to have.
Okay, well, I suggest we call it RADG. Would that be good? RADG. So why don't we take a coffee break, and the next session begins, well, in 10 minutes.